What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to FudgeMuppet. I'm Scott, here with Michael and Drew as always. This is the Elder Scrolls podcast, and today we are talking all about the centerpiece of Mundus. We are talking about Lorkhan, the missing god, and his various other names. But which one of you guys would like to start us off with a little bit of a primer about this being?
Okay, Lorkhan is credited with creating Mundus and everything we see in the Elder Scrolls games. So everything you've explored in Tamriel is essentially his work. Now, he is quite an interesting god in the sense that he features across all the different pantheons. And in a nutshell, he is considered a god of men because he is seen as having given them the gift of mortality, and he's disliked, generally speaking, by the elves, who see him as being a trickster god who basically stole their divine form from them and made them into mortals and made them experience life just like men do, though they live a lot longer. But he's basically stolen divinity from them. So they have an unfavorable view of him, and men generally speaking, and we'll get into all the different niche cultural interpretations, but men generally, they really like him and they really appreciate the life that he's given them.
Yeah, it's worth noting that, like, in the community, you'll find these terms Padomaic and Anuic, and you'll often seen as a broad brush, Padomaic referring to a favorable view of Lorkhan, and Anuic being a unfavorable view, and that those names derive from the original sort of Anu and Padomay, the conflicting forces, and Padomay's derivative being Sithis, and then further down you have Lorkhan, and on the opposite side you have Anoiel and Auriel, and that kind of the way that all of the cultures feel about Lorkhan sort of give them that underlying theological sort of or premise. And like we were sort of saying, you'll have ideas of common men, like the Needs and so on, and the Nords. They generally believe that they are created by the gods, and therefore, it's their reality. They're thankful for their creators. And even if you look at Shazar's song and so on, when Shazar, which is the Lorkhan, the Cyrodiilic name for Lorkhan, they believe that Shazar convinced the other gods how to, look at the beauty we can create, and they all got enthusiastic about the project. Whereas the elves believed that those same gods, were tricked into making it, and they lost their power, and it's this one big devious trick. And there is some cool symbology and stuff there. You do see, like in the Red Guards, that he's depicted as a snake, and Shaw is actually depicted as a fox, which is typically like cunning fox and trickery and so on. But we can get into those. But I think one of the, like, we should probably stick to, I guess, some of the most core central facts that we know. And we can kind of talk about, I guess, convention. And does someone else want to take it away? Drew, do you want to get in there on convention and the heart and so on?
To very much take it from the beginning. It's kind of like, if you imagine using the monomyth as the source, because it's kind of the perfect way to look at it, is you've got Anu and Padomai at the top, Anwiel and Sithis, and then Auriel and Lorkhan. So Lorkhan and Auriel are kind of the opposites. And I mean, that's like, just as a passing comment, it's an unusual, kind of ironic thing about the High Elves is that they see themselves as very pure. It's kind of like Anu is this perfect light, ineffable and cannot be quenched. It's ever bright, and any shadow, like Padomai being the shadow, is a kind of taint on the light. And you can kind of see their worldview as trying to get back to that, but that's kind of impossible. And the fact that they exist in the first place relies on the interplay of Anu and Padomai. So Lorkhan, as much as they hate him, is essential to their existence. So then in the early days, when you've got Auriel and Trinimac, who are kind of the heads of what High Elves generally believe nowadays, is that we need to get back into heaven. They're begging Anu to take them back. Versus Lorkhan, who would probably most commonly be called Shaw here, because he's kind of like when he's the god of men, and the Nords hold on to this the strongest. But it was Shaw versus Auriel, the armies of men versus the armies of elves. So that's the old Elnathay, the elves, and the wandering Elnathay, the men. And they clashed, and Trinimac beat Lorkhan, and they took him to this convention where all the gods who committed their power to this world held him accountable, basically, and ripped out his heart and shot it across Tamriel, which is where Red Mountain erupted.
Yeah. And that's the heart of Lorkhan that you'll find later on. Also just worth noting that, where the heart of Lorkhan's underneath the Red Mountain, and the blood that it sort of pumps is the ebony, because the ebony is actually God's blood, and some cool stuff there.
As it flew across Tamriel, a little drop of blood fell down into an Aelid well and created the Amulet of Kings, essentially, or originally called the Kim Adabal or Kim El Adabal.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
complicated
ramifications.
name. Yeah.
A lot of ramifications of that, which I'm sure we'll talk
And
about Shaw's actual role in the Empire.
It's also worth noting that that what is presented, like the convention even, that's the typical story of the monomyth that you sort of get. But it is very much the elven view of things, even the idea, like you'll get other more obscure religions, like, even the Khajiit or the Reachmen have very different ideas about how it all went down. Some are more simple, like the Reachmen version, or more complex. But I think we could just start getting into some of the cultural interpretations. So,
well, that's one of the weirdest things about Lorkhan, right? Is that he's such a central god when you look behind the veil and you look behind the scenes of the Elder Scrolls universe, but you don't really see him or hear about him a whole lot. Because even the divines, they have, you're playing Oblivion, every city you go to, there's a cathedral to some divine, or there's the Daedric shrines where you get Daedric quests from. But unless you're going through some specific quests in, say, the Elder Scrolls Online, or you're just listening to the Nords ramble about Shaw, although, again, we know that they kind of, abandoned their old pantheon a lot by the time of Skyrim. I would have liked to see it a lot more, but we don't as much. So he definitely is a kind of behind-the-scenes figure. Something
to note there as well is that I think it's in pretty much every single pantheon, he is recognized as a dead god a lot of time, as a missing god.
Yes.
He's dead. He's in Sovngarde, or he sacrificed himself to create the realm of Mundus and Reachmen mythology. Or he's a deceased figure, so he's not seen as active, except, which we can get into much later, in sort of the ideas of Shezarines and stuff like that. But
I think an important thing to add to that is the idea that the way we interpret him being dead from a mortal perspective, it's very final. Whereas with Lorkhan, and I guess you could say with gods in general, that it doesn't quite work that way. You've got the last line of the monomyth, see if I can get it up here, that says, "But when Trinamak and Auriel tried to destroy the heart of Lorkhan, it laughed at them and said, 'This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other.'" So the idea is that even though his impact on Tamriel isn't strong, he's linked to it. You can't remove him from it. So his will kind of is done through the machinations of the planet.
And I mean, his heart's still beating too. In some ways, he is very much alive.
Well, another one of his names too, sort of, the Doom Drum. And if you envision, the Elder Scrolls as a song, his reference as a sort of Doom Drum is that bass beat of the whole world, and you can't have the song without it, so it's kind of it's got to stay there, and he is essential.
So long as the world is alive, he is alive in some form. It's like, if you imagine the Daedric realms, it's kind of just the mindscape of a Daedric prince. It's part of their being, and even if the Daedric prince isn't there, you can't remove it from them. And Tamriel, or Mundus in general, is kind of like a group project of original spirits before there were Daedra and Aedra, before there were ancestors and not ancestors, and all of those who were involved, Lorkhan at the head of that, they are, you can't completely remove them from this world without destroying the world, and so if Lorkhan was physically beaten and sundered, and there's a theory that he is the moons, which we'll talk about, but no matter what you do to him, he's there. And his heart is beating, and ebony's being pumped through the earth, and his influence is always there.
Well, to expand upon, I guess, the ultimate worldview, and kind of like we've talked about with Thalmor Grand Plan, they would be very happy with completely undoing even what they are and becoming some sort of spirits in Aetherius. They see Lorkhan as the ultimate evil. So in a way, you can kind of look at the Thalmor belief as kind of nihilistic. They want everything to be undone. They have no... everything, they're in flesh prisons. They don't want to be there at all. So they really, even if he is essential, I feel like their main motive is, well, let's undo him completely. They don't have any sort of feelings going.
So I was just going to say, it is interesting if you think about it, because while you can say, we're derived from these ancestor spirits and we want to go back there, as mortals and being born as mortals, they have no concept at all of what being a god or spirit is like. And so for them to crave it so desperately is quite strange when you consider that they have no reference range. Like, for example, if I'm I don't know, when you die, you're going to go to heaven. You say, what's heaven like? And I describe this beautiful world that would make sense to walk through as a human, and all your relatives are there, and I don't know, you can eat all the food you want, or whatever, right? But for them, it's like, oh, I just really want to float around eternally as a god, and whatever that means, I just want it because it was taken from me. Like, there's no mortal reference range for them, because they don't have really the experience of something so
abstract.
out of a flesh bag, or abstract.
There's something. There's a little it's a little bit of conjecture on my part, but one thing that when they talk about elves, I feel like a lot of the elves sort of envision is like, I'm going to have my soul go to Aetherius. It's going to be like this great heaven place. But I think in the total undoing of that, you sort of, Mundus, you can kind of undo all of the sort of conventional ideas of afterlife and everything, even when you get into some of those weird ideas like the dream sleep of souls, all of that becomes unbound. And if you actually, I think it's even in the monomyth that it says that, the how the Elnafey came about is that these certain there were really powerful beings and everything, spirits, the At-Arda, but as they were trapped and their power was drained and invested in creation, they ended up eventually having to rely on physical copulation to reproduce and so on, and continually they had to rely on that. They couldn't just sort of create anymore with their power, and then so they eventually...
Oh no.
So eventually you get the realms of mortals. But the idea is, I think if you would undo that, is that a lot of these people, I guess, kind of all come from a similar common, like, spirit thing, like oversoul kind of stuff. Like, it might be this bigger spiritual energy kind of stuff. You're not like, I don't know if anyone's watching Neon Genesis Evangelion, like returning to the liquid at the end or something, but it's kind of like, I can imagine in a sort of a unifying force, in a way that if you hear, anyone who's taken some DMT and they're like, when we die, we're going to reconvene with the universe and like just reconvene with consciousness as a whole, like some kind of more abstract concept. But I feel like what would happen is something more along like that, because even the divisions of mortals and going down is a sort of construct that only exists because of Mundus, like something that only happened because of that. But
I can't help but feel like I would massively be on the side of men. And I mean, it's funny because obviously elves and men are different, but really they're all mortals. It's not like I was saying, it's not like the elves have some like recollection really of being gods. They're just mortals that live for a lot longer than the men do. So if all three of us even, let's just say we have a lifespan of 300 years, okay? Would you want to go and all reconvene in some spirit that you have no real relation to or understanding of, just kind of sounds flowery and nice? Or because all the afterlives are real, like the other ones, do you two want to go with me to Sovngarde and dine on meat and battle and have fun forever? All these other options sound so much more appealing, because you only have your mortal reference range.
It's the slightly awkward thing about the lore, which gets really out there if you think about it too much. But it's the difference between kind of being in the endless cycle. So the world ends, everyone goes to their afterlives, and then they come back from the dream sleeve, and they're put back in this mortal realm, and it goes again and again, versus destroying the world but also escaping it. You need Numantia, which Mankar Cameron talks about, like liberty and freedom, and actually, as there's suggestions that Vivek has done, is removing yourself from the situation and looking on the world, and that's where things get a little bit weird, because I don't know, that it comes back to that irony I was talking about with the high elves. Is like they're trying to achieve total purity that's just really not achievable, and in doing so they're incredibly pessimistic about the universe they've got. And it's something they really strive for, but they just can't actually make happen.
It just sounds like not a fun existence to constantly not appreciate what your current situation. They're not living in the now. They're very much living in a future idealistic situation. I suppose when you put it like that, though, you talk about escaping the cycle. That can sound appealing, because if we all went to Sovngarde and then we all eventually just rebirthed into some new cycle, and you don't have any recollection of who you were before, I'd prefer a Sovngarde that would last forever and not be subject to cycles. But that's not what they're going to get. They're going to have some weird, flazy woozy, whatever.
In a way to think about it, though, to step out of the cycle on like a personal level would be like, if you killed yourself or if you died, right? The cycle that you live in every day is the sun rises, you wake up, new day, you go to sleep, and so on. But if you ask me personally, it's like, I want to wake up tomorrow and I want to keep going. Do you know what I mean? So it does become a real.
But what if you lost your memories, like, and had to start again as a different person in a?
Well, if I
different
lost my
place?
memories, I wouldn't know, would I? So
But wouldn't you? But now knowing the options, wouldn't you prefer a mix? So you have an afterlife that lasts forever, but won't start again, and you lose all your memories. And
you feel,
Go on. I was going to take it in a slightly different direction. So I don't know if you wanted to interject before I do, but
no, go for it.
no, okay. Well, it also depends how you look on the afterlives, because looking at it from a Nordic perspective, Sovngarde is this fantastic place where great heroes go to feast and fight and drink, and but at the same time, for Shaw, who is Lorkhan, it is kind of a continuation of what I was talking about with this battle between Lorkhan and Auriel and Trinimac, where it's preparing to, for the end of the world / the beginning of the world, because of the cycle, to return and fight that war again. And really, if you kind of consider the current timeline that we know about, Lorkhan should really want to kind of have another go, because this one hasn't really gone that much in his favor. He's been split in half, his heart's been torn out, he's kind of become forgotten.
But wouldn't that happen at the start of every cycle? Well, I guess it depends. You don't know.
The Dawn can go any way. Like, say Lorkhan's the armies of men win, and the Malefic era, it literally is the Elven for the era of the elves, and that's when they dominate, and then eventually men come along and kind of they become the centerpiece of Tamriel's history and politics. And in a new cycle where Lorkhan men win over Auriel and Trinimac, perhaps there would have been no Malefic era. It would have been an era of men.
Well, what I'm saying is, but Lorkhan
totally
has
different.
to die for the cycle to exist, because he needs to be the heart of creation to start it. Like, if Mundus doesn't die, if he doesn't die, then he can't sustain Mundus. So his heart is, so every cycle.
But he's got to be committed to Mundus. But does he necessarily need to be killed by the other Atada who are involved?
I think so,
in
because
creation?
So would he be like a
I
living,
think so, because-
a living
Yeah, he'd be
Mundus,
much more
just like
involved.
alive with his heart, and he is the world? Or what?
I don't. I think it is to do with death. Only that. Well, it depends. If you go in, this can get really whack. So should we probably anchor this back? But if you go into the stuff with the whole all the amaranth and the scarab and all of this kind of stuff, but it's like, if you view the top down, you've got all of the Anu Padme and derivatives down, right? The idea is this sort of interesting test is the Sijic endeavor. When you're down here in mortality, you're actually going back up by seeking transcendence and seeking Kim, and actually kind of getting outside the cycle by sort of seeing the godhead above Anu Padme, kind of, and you can become the scarab, the amaranth or whatever, and create the new world, the new godhead kind of thing. But that's how he kind of escapes the death. It gets a little a lot of this is abstract outside Kirkbride stuff as well, that you recombine in, for example, there might just be a word amaranth you see around, but then that's all that's in the canon kind of thing. But you know what I mean?
It's fleshed out by him outside of it.
But let's leave
come
that.
back to that at the end once we've gotten through all the proper lore.
So we've talked about the elves version of things, which kind of, it does mesh well with the Nordic versions of things, because they sort of believe in this idea of the armies of elves and men against one another, and which is ultimately the old Elnafey and the wandering Elnafey being the men. But we'll get to that. But to start with the just to clarify that the traditional elven sort of belief comes from the Oldmer, which is the great ancestor elves carried on supposedly in its most pure form by the Altmer, and then there's ever slightly derivatives with some of the other elven races, but except with the Dunmer, which we have a bit of a difference with. But on the side of men, I guess the root sort of men perspective comes from Atmora. So even the Nedics have some sort of various different versions of him, but the needs of Alicia's slave rebellion and so on believed in the elven gods. But Shaw, and what came across with Atmora was sort of, the idea of Shaw and the very and his armies, and very favorable view of man. So their idea is that creation happened, and then there is Shaw and the armies of Shaw, which is all the Nordic gods, Orkine and Storn and so on, who literally fought the elven gods, Auriel, Trinimac, and so on, and they had this massive war, but Auriel won because Trinimac's tough, and then Door Out His Heart and Convention happened. But we've kind of talked about this before, is the idea that Shaw is loading up Sovngarde as god of the underworld now, sort of loading up Sovngarde with soldiers to have a try again next time at the start of the Dawn era, whether or not that's ever going to be successful. But yeah.
Well, to take that into another interpretation of the same god, this kind of leads perfectly into what we know as Shazar, which is the Cyrodiilic version of Shaw or Lorkhan. So, you have Alicia's Slave Rebellion, where these needs have been subjugated by the Aelids for all their lives. So, despite all their hardships, the gods they know are the elven gods. So when Alicia prays, she prays to the elven gods. And when finally just to cut straight to the end, the rebellion is successful, and now she's in the position, after getting help from the Nords, while also having all of these slaves who worship the elven gods, how does she make a religion that kind of can appeal to everyone? It's cosmopolitan and doesn't upset anyone too much. And that's where you kind of see Lorkhan or Shaw really kind of get forgotten about, at least in the most common pantheon, the 8 divines, because Shazar kind of needs to be swept under the rug so that those who worship the elves and the elves in general are not going to be too upset about his inclusion.
Well, that's the thing too, like even Shazar as a concept is a toned down version of the aggressive Shaw, which is like a warlord, and made like, he's sort of saying, the undertaking of man is kind of his thing. It's a very light version. But
all the elf killing stuff has to be forgotten for the pantheon of the 8 divines to kind of flourish. And I guess you can say that's why Akatosh gets put at the forefront of it, because it's kind of a blend of different elements.
Exactly. I know Drew likes the and there's been videos on the channel and stuff before about how Lorkhan and Shazar is truly like the god of man, but to go forth in this cosmopolitan way, they sort of had to brush him under the rug, and they've changed things. But one thing we've also discussed is that we know like history looking backwards, like from here, but we don't know at what point the sort of Shazar kept on sort of disappearing to history. Like it could have been much earlier, or it could even been in First Era as late as Reachmen or something, until Reachmen came about, because then Reachmen even was considered a cultural god at some point, and he might have taken limelight away. And people would say now that Talos is sort of like the new empire god, which may have something to do with Lorkhan anyway, as some sort of we won't get into that one. Let's leave
the way I see Akatosh is kind of taking Auriel and taking elements of Shaw and kind of combining them in this pantheon. So when you see, it's very much the Cyrodiilic way to view Akatosh as having one head of a dragon and one head of a man, and that's, for me at least, there are lots of hints about this in the lore. Like a lot of it comes from what's his name? I'm blanking on his name. The ape man who kind of leads Maruk. Yeah. A lot of that comes from there. The idea that they want to remove the Aldmeri taint from Akatosh, and it does seem to be that Akatosh was built from a combination of the time god and the god who kind of allowed men to escape the clutches of elven slavery.
It's interesting. There's a Maracati selective quote about Shazar being the missing sibling of Akatosh, like despite them being monotheistic, and saying, I think it's singularly misplaced, as in being the missing god, and therefore doubly venerated. So it's almost as if there's this subtle recognition of Shazar or Lorkhan being like the true,
especially
god.
With the 2 heads, I wonder, and also being favorable of creation. Ultimately, what creation comes down to is the meeting of Anu and Padme, and then obviously their derivatives, more specifically Mundus and so on. But without both of those essential forces, you can't have it in a way. And both Shazar, or other name Lorkhan, or Akatosh, other name Auriel, are both derivatives of both those 2 essential forces. So when you create and make your Akatosh, the central figure of your pantheon and so on, is basically a synthesis of both the essential forces, and therefore very favorable of creation, because you need both those essential forces to have Mundus and so on. And also happens that their mythology is very has a good look on creation and so on. But yeah, it's it's an interesting view of things, but I reckon let's move to the Dunmer, because while we're keeping things really early and not as abstract, because the Khajiit, they do a whole different thing, and the Reachmen have got their own thing, and even the Red Guards have got their sort of own thing as well. So what's somewhat related is we can start off the Dunmer story. All starts with the Chimer's exodus at the guidance of the prophet Veloth, who hears the words from Boethia, but also Mephala and sort of Azura, and these are the three good Daedra that lead them away. And there's various stories as to what exactly happens, but the gist of it is that Trinimac comes with his army of followers, and they try and stop the prophet Veloth from leaving with his followers, the Velothi, who would later become the Chimer. And then there's the things where it's like Boethia stabbed him, or Mephala did it, or there was trickery involved. But one of the interesting things there too that I just happen to like, it's not necessarily super important, but how Boethia speaks almost like lovingly towards Lorkhan, and sort of calls out Trinimac for like spreading lies about him, basically, and sort of like, I forgot what the exact phrasing of the quote is. But yeah, so anyway, they're unsuccessful at stopping them. Trinimac gets eaten, you get Malakath, all that kind of stuff. But then the Chimer go and leave to Resdain, which then becomes Morrowind later. They get changed into the Dunmer, and the Tribunal come about because of the heart of Lorkhan. But the central piece of their mythology is, instead of having the best response to the Sundering being tears and sadness and so on, like Trinimac, they essentially believe that Lorkhan's realm and trickery and this prison that they've been put in is the ultimate test, and the Sijic Endeavor is the path to enlightenment, to ascend beyond it through your personal challenge and such. And I mean, in ways, the Tribunal kind of did that inadvertently in a way, but yes.
I think a nice quote involving that actually comes from Sermon 10 of the 36 Lessons of Vivek, where they refer to Lorkhan as the frame maker.
Yeah.
And it says, "We pledge ourselves to you, the frame maker, the scarab, a world for us to love you in, a cloak of dirt to cherish."
And the scarab is a symbol of, like, Lorkhan also comes up. Yeah, House Redoran's thing is a symbol, and I'm pretty sure it's the sixth house. It's related sort of symbology there as well. But I mean, it's pretty straightforward. We've talked at length about the Dunmer and their Sijic Endeavor and stuff before. But it's pretty straightforward. In its most boiled down essence, it is trying to more or less achieve Kim, or some form of transcendence, and ultimately Amaranthal, and yeah.
And it does show the complexity of not simply following the Aedra, because even the Daedra, who are considered more malevolent, have an essential role to play in this Dunmer philosophy of the Sijic Endeavor, like the House of Troubles, having, Malakath be the test of physical strength, Sher Gorath the test of mental, and Mehrunes Dagon is the elements, and all these things that are against you, and Molag Bal.
If you take the Dark Elf sort of like most basic thing from like Dungeons and Dragons and old stuff, like doom and gloomy kind of stuff, and like suffering, and they've kind of taken that in the Elder Scrolls and sort of changed it a little bit and sort of made it like a suffering for enlightenment kind of philosophy. But I guess we should maybe mention the Reachmen next, just because it's more brief, and it is also very similar in the same way that they view creation as sort of a place to sort of suffer, and like as a challenge to take yes. Their idea is that there is Namira, the spirit queen of the dark, the void, and then basically you have Lork, who is Lorkhan, and he comes to Namira and then wants to create this mortal realm, but then he has to basically sacrifice himself to do it, ripping of the heart, yada yada, and then you've got the mortal realm, and then Hircine actually becomes the Lord of the Flesh and the mortal realm, and he's a far more important for the Reachmen.
I quite like how the creation story with the Reachmen actually talks about Lork having this epiphany when he visited the darkness, that nothingness, instead of viewing nothingness as nothingness, it's like, here's this space that's ripe for possibility. And I almost like how you can imagine Reachmen could relate that internally too. Yeah. Like, how like men, like, people in life, I've got no meaning, or there's this hole in me, or like, there's a void, but instead it's like seeing a void as like a place to fill with meaning. Yeah. And like stuff like that. It's just a cool way of looking at it. And also, interestingly, this lore makes all the Briarheart stuff way cooler. Because, you know, when I was first playing Skyrim and you see the Hag Ravens and the Briarhearts, I'm not thinking of Lorkhan.
Yeah.
But now when I see it, it's, you know that there's actually involvement in that ritual.
There's a video at the start of this year that we've got on the channel that is about the sort of idea that Briarhearts are a Lorkhanic reenactment, because if you envision the Hag Ravens as sort of, because they've been often connected with Namira, and that's maybe what warps their form and so on, and if you sort of take that at face value, in that reenactment, you've got, you know, the potential Briarheart being like the Lorkhan in the situation, and you've got the Hag Raven being Namira, and they, you know, ripping out his heart to create something new, and that's, you know, the big powerful Briarheart and such.
Yeah. Well, like using the metaphor of a hole in the heart for like the physical challenges he represents is like, it is very literal across all kinds of cultures, because, you know, just looking at, to briefly dip back to Shazar, you know, with Pelennor, who's considered to be an aspect of Shazar, a Shezarene, there's a line from the Song of Pelennor that says, "Beneath the Pelennor star armor was a chest that gaped open to show no heart, only a red rage-shaped diamond fashion." And then from the Remenada, you've got Alicia's description. It says, "On her breast, a wound that spilt void onto her mangled feet."
And
so it's always about a hole in the heart or a corruption of the heart or something missing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And with the Reachmen specifically as well, they talk about how the Briarhearts are actually in a state of suffering and constant pain, but this transformation that they've gone through, the pain to do, obviously is in the interests of protecting the clan.
Yeah.
So it's like a worthy sacrifice for the rest.
Yeah. But yeah, so hearts are a big core symbology of all, because I mean we can go to it now.
Just before we move on, real quick little fun fact. But is it the Totem of the Hunt? Whichever totem is just the straight bone is actually considered a shard of Lork's ribs in Reachmen mythology. Yeah, the Totem of the Hunt, and it's said to be able to. It's called the Wand of Bone. Said to be able to confound a target, which, you know, any mortal, like confuse them, like, I suppose.
Yeah.
Just a interesting little tidbit
Fun
before we move off Reachmen entirely.
Actually, let's. I was going to say maybe Khajiit, but let's do Redguard. So we've talked about basically sort of the core Anuic and Patamaic cultures, so man and elves, and then you've got the variation of the dark elves, which is what is just rare, which you'd call Patamaic elves. Like elves usually don't have that. On the flip side, for men, Redguards have an Anuic view of things, and they look at it as a big trick that happened to them. I feel like I've been dominating. Does anyone want to carry on with the Redguard?
Well, I want to find the exact source, but you've because I'm just going off what I remember here. But you've got when Satakal, the world serpent, is eating itself, you've got Ruptgar Tulpapa, who essentially is fulfilling the role of your Auriel, who has found a way to kind of walk sideways and avoid destruction of the self.
Yeah, to exist through the cycles. Yeah.
Whereas Sep is like this sneaky serpent creature who has taken the detritus of old world skins and rolled it all together to create this kind of abomination that ends up becoming the mortal realm. So it very much it's not, you know, specifically a trick, but it's kind of a corruption is how they perceive Sep's role in this. And so he's very much portrayed in a more negative light than Ruptgar, who is kind of the father.
I'll just grab the actual the varieties of.
Is it from the monomyth?
I think there's parts in it there as well.
Yeah.
I'll just read. So let's just read it like word for verbatim. So Satak was the first serpent, the snake who came before, and all the worlds to come rested in the glimmer of its scales. So that's referring to like the cycles of the Kalpa. It's kind of Satak or Satakal is just essentially the singular embodiment of Anu and Padme in other mythologies. But it was so big that there was nothing but, and thus it was coiled around and around itself, and the worlds to come slid across each other, but none had room to breathe or even be, and so worlds called to something to save them, to let them out. But of course there was nothing outside the first serpent, so aid had to come from inside it. This was Akel, the hungry stomach. Akel made itself known, and Satak could only think about what it was, and it was the best hunger, so it ate and ate. Soon there was enough room to live in the worlds, and things began. These things were new, and they often made mistakes, for there was hardly time to practice being things before. So most things ended quickly, or were not good, or gave up on themselves. Some things were about to start, but they were eaten up as Satak got to that part of its body. This was a violent time. So pretty soon, Akel caused Satak to bite its own heart, and that was the end. The hunger, though, refused to stop, even in death, and so the first serpent shed its skin to begin anew. That's being the Kalpic cycles. As the old world died, Satakal began, and when things realized this pattern, so did they realize what their part in it was. They began to take names. So this is the Ada, like Rupska or Tuwaka, being Akatosh or Arke, and they strode about looking for their kin. As Satakal ate itself over and over, the stronger spirits learned to bypass the cycle by moving at strange angles. They called this process the walkabout, a way of striding between the world skins. Ruptika was so big that he was able to place stars in the sky so that weaker spirits might find their way easier. This practice became so easy for the spirits that it became a place called the Far Shores, a time of waiting to the next skin. So it's kind of like they haven't got there's not the negative perception at the moment. It's almost like a little middle ground, but their cycles are already happening for them in their sort of view of things, and they're just looking for ways to escape it. They use the walkabout, and then basically these gods that are existing through the cycles of the old world. But Ruptka was able to sire many children. He became known as Tall Papa. He continued to place stars in the void for others, but after so many cycles, there were almost too many spirits to help out. And he made himself a helper from the Detrius of past skins, and this was Sep, or the second
That's
serpent.
the one. Yeah, I got that mixed up. So Sep himself was made from this detritus.
Yeah,
so
and he is Lorkhan. So Sep had much of the hungry stomach still left him from Sadakal. So multiple hungers from multiple skins. He was so hungry he could not think straight. Sometimes he would just eat the spirits he was supposed to help, but Tall Papa would always reach in and take them back out. Finally, tired of helping Tall Papa, Sep went out and gathered the rest of the old skins and balled them up, tricking spirits to help him, promising them that this was how you reached the new world, by making one of the old. These spirits loved this way of living. It was easier than the walkabout, so no more jumping from place to place. Many spirits joined in, believing this was good thinking, and Tall Papa just shook his head. So I can kind of what basically happens here is that
he makes an instant gratification route of doing it the easy way, and everyone's like, yeah, that sounds way better. And I'll tell you what's really funny. I don't know why. I don't know if I'm mantling this god, but my stomach was just churning the whole time. Saying he was so hungry, and it's like vibrating, and like there's all kinds of creation myths inside.
Just to touch to the last part, I may as well, because we're there, and it does like tie it up nicely. But pretty soon the spirits on the skin ball, aka the Mundus, started to die because they were very far from the real world of Satakal, and they found that it was too far to jump into the far shores now. The spirits that were left pleaded with Tall Papa to take them back, but Grim Ruptga would not, and he told the spirits that they must learn new ways to follow the stars to the far shores now. If they could not, then they must live on through their children, which was not the same as before, aka procreation, becoming mortals. Sep, however, needed more punishment, and so Tall Papa squashed the snake with a big stick, and the hunger, which is also, some people connect it to the adamantine tower. So that's the one tower that exists at convention. That's Tall Papa's stick going bang,
that's cool.
Squashing him.
That's nice.
So the hunger fell out of Sep's dead mouth, and the only thing left of the hunger fell out of Sep's death, and was the only thing left of the second serpent, and they believing that hunger is the heart of Lorkhan. And so while the rest of the world was allowed to strive back to godhood, Sep could only slink around in a dead skin or swim about the sky, a hungry void that jealously tried to eat the stars, which is interesting, like connecting that to the serpent star out of the star signs, which just doesn't have a particular month ordained to it. It just sort of goes through and appears when. So, yeah.
Even though it's dressed a different way, that is really similar to the High Elven perspective of things. So as you said, it's very Anuic, and it kind of comes back to what we were discussing before about the potential of whether Lorkhan could stay whole and the mortal realm still exist, or if he's doomed to always lose and he's always going to be beaten. But from the Yakudan perspective, his very conceptualization, the moment he's born from that detritus, he's made from dead skin. He is dead.
Yeah.
As well as this realm of his, it is made from dead skins. Everything about it is dead. So it's kind of unnatural in that sense that it goes against all the normal rules and and what the spirits represent. So that's kind of Lorkhan's trick. Whereas I imagine if you approach humans or maybe dark elves, it's not quite so dark in nature, Lorkhan's role.
Well, if we want to throw in a curveball and go to High Rock, they actually have their own version, Shior, considered the bad man. And this is quite interesting. And I don't know if this is just a theory, if this would come from like when the elves were oppressing them.
Oh,
more.
for sure, yeah.
And it's like, because when you read it, he is like a god of crop failure. Like I can just imagine them harvesting crops for their elven overlords, and when there's a bad season, they're like, the elves tell them this is Shaw's fault.
It's actually interesting too, because that concept of Shior being born there as this as sort of like spirit who just causes bad things to happen, and like crop failure, a majority of them you can imagine were just the servants or basically the peasants of the Durrani who are so involved in crop making. And like that's most of their job. They don't have all these other jobs, so that's why the crop failure stands out there as such
he was said to be
thing.
Born during the dark years after the fall of Sarthal, and also a lot of theologians agree he's like this demon, obviously a demonized version of the Nordic shore. It's interesting though, and this is an Elder Scrolls Online trinket thing. But there's these sculptures created by the Bretons' Nedic ancestors that were found in Glenumbra, which paint what appears to be Shior before he was villainized, and pair him with Mara. However, when I go and look at it, I don't know if it exactly says that. Manmer coupled idol. And there's a few different people's perspectives on it. Like how often this figure of an elven woman bears hallmarks of Old Mary depictions of Mara, but it's too rudimentary. Was it the work of a child? That's Nedic sculpting, actually. Devotional idols were common, though I've never seen one depicting an elven divine before. Her pose suggests she's in a lover's embrace. It's clear that there's another piece to this figure. And then it says, yes, this new figure fits snugly with the Mara, but I never expected her lover to be a man. Is he meant to be Lorkhan? I don't think I've ever seen evidence of Old Mary culture being welcomed with such open arms, quite literally. But it's very theoretical.
I was thinking before, actually, that it's interesting that... I was thinking before that you could potentially describe Anuik versus Padomaic on the basis of the view of Lorkhan, but that's not necessarily true, because it has to be mortality, because, for example, for the Bretons, Shior... he's almost seen as a different figure, so it's not exactly fair, but he is seen as a negative figure. However, they still kind of have the beliefs of men, of being divinely created and all of that kind of stuff. They don't have this very return to ancestor. Then again, maybe there might be some more lore added later or something, or maybe back in the past they would have had more elven, like pre-Empire conquests, they might have had a more elven view of things. So
I was pretty much going to say exactly that. Elder Scrolls 6 might change something, but as things currently stand, the Bretons have kind of always been done a bit dirty, but it also makes sense. Like, while other races are having their existential conversations and they're thinking about the workings of the universe, the Breton view of Shior is just, it's as simple as crops. That's all that really matters. But then when you kind of look at the origins of Bretons, which isn't super fleshed out, but simply the fact that the Durrani elves took the best needs and decided to just breed them for fun, it kind of strips them of any real ancestral history and folklore and mythology. They're kind of just a mishmash of two things that they get separated from. They don't really have any connection to what's Durrani and what's High Elven, and they don't really have that much of a connection to the needs they used to be. So their view on gods like Shior, because it makes sense that it's pretty empty.
What would happen to a Breton if like creation was undone? I suppose
what would happen to everyone else, but
the
one thing. What's interesting, it's funny. It's like Bretons have no culture, but like the Durrani essentially eventually would erase their native Nedic culture and so on. But the human culture that they have came because of a colonialist empire that came in and sort of imperial cult flavored everything somewhat. So it's just, I'm sure there is lots of hidden places. That's something I hope we see in Elder Scrolls 6, that lots of like hidden little gods and like microcultures that have somehow thrived as gods.
So I was just going to say where my thoughts were going. Like, how would you feel as a Breton knowing that you have kind of elvish blood, but also like, you know, you're a mix of men and
I think it just comes down to the
and
culture.
there's two perspectives on
I think
either
it comes
side saying different things.
I think it comes down to the culture and the fact that they also consider themselves, for the large part, that they're just men. Like they don't
Especially by the time of Skyrim, at least they took out so much of the elvish features and stuff. Like if you look at the concept art from the Oblivion handbook that came with the game, they looked like way more like pointy eared, kind of, you know, elvish featured humans, but they kind of just look like pugs in the presets for Skyrim. I was not a fan. They made them like, I don't know if this ugly's not the right word, but they kind of like made them all look like a kind of,
it's odd. They gave them, because I know across
they gave them weird features.
They had these really deep forehead creases, for example, and it's like I feel that's what Skyrim's problem is. They gave a lot of the races like these essential features you can't change. Like Bretons need forehead creases, elves need these ridges here to do this, and it's kind of like, I don't know. I'd like a little bit more custody. Like, do you know what I mean?
But at least make it make sense. Like, what about being a mix between an elf and a man means forehead wrinkles and that kind of big forehead vibe? I don't know. They're just
But
they're just frowning a lot because they're always thinking about their crops failing.
But also to consider, I wonder how much you know, because High Rock's such a turbulent place politically. You can also imagine it is a similar deal culturally, and then, you know, around the Reach, like ideas of. Interestingly, actually, they might look upon the Reachmen, you know, obviously they do, as beneath them and so on. And so they might look upon their sort of view of Lorkhan and stuff, and they might further associate him negatively because, you know, they revere Lork as, you know, the creator of the world and everything. So they might like look at it. That would have helped their view of Sheol, maybe, like a negative view.
Well, the Reachmen, really, you could make the argument that they're the only people in High Rock that properly have their own true culture that has gone back a long time. You know, I mean, I could get roasted alive for making this comparison, but I almost so far currently view High Rock kind of like how I view the US in the real world, is that it's a relatively new country where kind of like it prides itself on being able to mix, you know, cultures mix here, and this is, you know, the land of the free or whatever, and High Rock is, that's kind of their shtick as well. It's to find a hill, become a king, and it's not so much about your ancestry and the history that's been on this land and whatnot. It's more about, no, this is my legacy now, and, you know, I'm the beginning of this mythology kind of thing.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
So you just don't really have that with just basic Breton.
Interesting point you pointed out there too. I don't know, it just clicked for me then, but the Reachmen potentially having like a very straight line to their old religion, basically, but it's very Daedra influenced, and I kind of wonder how many Daedra were actually worshipped amongst Nedic populations. Might be different names, obviously not by the same understanding. Because remember, to clarify for everyone, Daedra is an elven definition. Aedra meaning our ancestors, Daedra meaning not our ancestors. And if you also consider that really, like, men don't consider them their ancestors, they consider the gods, the Aedra, their creators. So even that doesn't really, while they still use the term as Adric, it's not used in its, like, you know, truest, most, I guess, original definition by the races of man. So basically it can equalize the Daedra and Adrian on a plane. They're just all old spirits to them. I guess some helped with creation, some didn't, without like the elven influence on the religion. But yeah, so maybe there's some really cool stuff with the needs. Early Nedic tribes and stuff, they might have had more of a mix like other cultures. You know, especially because, you know, in the same way that the Dark Elves view the Daedra and but they're also quite pro Lorkhan but yeah, anyway.
I suppose we should probably move to the Khajiit.
Yeah, let's
it just
move to
feels
Khajiit.
right that we have to move to the Khajiit, who have Lorkhaj, and I guess in their culture he's very much more involved with the moons. Like, he's considered a moon prince.
Well, let's hit Khajiit, then we'll address the sort of Lunar Lorkhan thing, and then we'll finish off with the Mythic Dawn commentaries.
That's what I've been holding off on the whole time.
All right.
And then there was such a perfect segue after what you were saying, but I'm like, oh, I have to hit the Khajiit.
Yeah.
Well, one segue that we did have to the Khajiit was when we were talking about the kind of hole in the heart idea. You know, I mean, with the Khajiit, there are elements of multiple pantheons that you can kind of like find similarities with. But just to give the general gist, you've got Anu and Fadamai who give birth to their litters of what are the Atada, the original spirits, the gods, and the final cat of the litter to be born was Lorkhan, who was born at a time where Anu discovered Fadamai giving birth when he didn't want any more children, so she fled to the Great Darkness, Namira, and gave birth to him there, and his heart was then corrupted by Namira, by the Great Darkness, which Azura then needed to purge from him, tear out, and fling away. So you can kind of see similarities to a lot of other cultures and views of Lorkhan there.
It's interesting because I don't know how they... I guess... Would they fall more under the Anuic or Patamaic? It's very hard to... Like, it's a very thin line.
The creation story is kind of Anuic, but the importance of figures like Azura, Mephala, and Boethra to them are very similar to the Dunmer. Like, I generally consider their pantheon to be closest to the Dunmer, even though there are strong like original elven elements there as well.
Yeah, because they're kind... Yeah, definitely. Because they also, I mean, another big thing too with the Patamaic Anuic, which often happens, is, you know, there's a tendency towards Aedra or Daedra on that kind of thing, whereas the Khajiit really don't really acknowledge Aedra Daedra at all. Really, they seem to see a lot of. I'm pretty sure there's a reference that they refer to several Daedra as ancestor spirits and so on, but so do the Dunmer as well. Actually, I like the ancestor Daedra and so on, but.
Actually, I think I've said it on the podcast before, but there's a line from Haskell that I quite like when talking about the Khajiit, because he says, I've never liked cats personally. Well, actually, that's irrelevant, but that's a bit mean. But I suppose because they're inexplicable and unpredictable, I'm told the Khajiit revere both the Aedra and the Daedra, worshipping whichever divine seems most applicable to whatever they're praying for or swearing by. But then to a cat, immediate personal convenience is everything. In fact, you're not paying attention anymore. That's literally what he says. But basically, he's saying that it's wise that the cats don't really bother to draw these kind of unimportant distinctions. They worship who is relevant to whatever they're worshipping.
It sounds similar to the Aelids in a way, but obviously very different, because the Aelids would have been hyper aware of distinctions, but just chosen to give into the temptations. Whereas Khajiits feel a lot more just... There's no... oh, let's worship him for this immense personal gain or because of some sadistic pleasure. It's just very much like we appreciate this aspect of life and we think it's best personified by this Daedra. And so, you know, we worship him or her.
Yeah, I think... we've got a Khajiit episode at some point to go up to, which I feel like
I was
going to
say we should...
then.
Yeah.
But I guess, do we want to address this Lunar Lorkhan stuff? Because it's debated, isn't it? And I think, from memory, I'm not a giant fan of the idea, of the theory, that the bodies of the moons are the bodies of Lorkhan. Kind of especially since he isn't his heart has been found. And also, isn't it... They also, Joan and Jode are explicitly, known as gods and so on. And
that's why I don't buy the Lunar Lorkhan theory. It basically just says that the moons, Massa and Secunda, are two halves of Lorkhan's, quote, flesh divinity. And then there's also there's the dark heart and all of that.
Yeah, I feel like the Lunar Lorkhan theory kind of predated any of the Khajiit stuff relating to Joan and Jode. I could be wrong about that, but I feel like that's
because they also believe the sort of the dark moon is the den of Lorkhan, the sort of behind Joan and Jode. But so
they think that's his corpse, basically.
I think the theory of the Lunar Lorkhan, it's like it's most valuable as just a metaphor to kind of his sundering, and the cycles of the moons is important in maintaining, not just life on Tamriel, but the tides and whatnot. So the idea that he was sundered, split apart, and his heart was taken out, it would be pretty easy to make the assumption that, those two moons up there, those are his body doing, walking, as kind of the Red Guards say, he's just doomed to walk around, the and witness his creation, but be unable to take part in it anymore. But I don't think it really holds water.
It gets a bit confusing because it's like an eclipse between two moons that create what they call a third moon, being the dark moon.
Yeah.
And then that represents some kind of duality between their missing god Lorkhan.
Remember, for everyone listening, like everything here is all a mythological take on Lorkhan. Like even the elven story, which is often taken as the most sort of like dominant or popular one, I guess, that people generally talk about when they're talking about it. Because I think it's mainly because it's very neat and cohesive, but a lot of the others, there's lots of contradictions that aren't necessarily less valid or anything like that. It's just what's the dominant belief or what you see in most of the books, and so on. And so obviously in sort of you like we sort of did with the moon theory, we don't really think it stacks up, or like you can go with Shior, like appearing after Sarthal and so on. So you can kind of look at some versions of Lorkhan as more of a caricature of a existence in mythology of like Shor or something, you know what I mean? But they change, and when gods change their cultural interpretation, often their history can change too. So yeah. Anyways, let's hit the
Mundus is Lorkhan's realm, and he's a Daedric prince.
It's not really that bold of a claim.
No, it's not.
Because especially when we just mentioned before, it's not essential to really draw strong distinctions between the Daedra and the Aedra. Obviously their involvement in creating the realm would kind of make Lorkhan an Aedra by pure definition. But all realms of Oblivion, all realms in general, are pockets of something in the void. And that's exactly what Mundus is. And it was Lorkhan's idea. It was just, as I said, a group project rather than an individual one.
So, but then they would all be in that realm as planets.
Well, yeah, exactly. Mankar's assertion is that they were his acolytes who usurped the Mundus from him and took it from him.
So then would they be Daedra? Because that's the thing, if the distinctions don't matter. They're just dead spirits in a realm.
I'd say they're whatever you want to call them.
Used up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a simple concept. I like how you've talked about this before, Drew, how when you look at the kind of the ideas of afterlife between Daedra and mortals, they're very similar anyway. They use different words, and mortals procreate with each other, whereas Daedra, they don't breed physically. But when a mortal dies and their spirit goes into the dream sleeve and then comes back, or a Daedra dies and they don't have a soul, but they have like a vestige, which goes back into the chaotic creation, and it all mixes around in some big plasm, and then they get reborn as well. Like the whole concept is not too different if you just look at it from an outside perspective and not that of purely immortal, where this is my thing and that's their weird thing. I think just sound the same.
I think it's the mortal misunderstanding or like not knowledge of Oblivion realms, and because they're so potentially complex and different and so little exposure that they can't see the similarities. But even if you were to look at Shivering Isles, it's like it's a civilization with New Sheoth and everything, something a little bit more tangible for a mortal to understand. But is it so impossible that it's this entire ecosystem like Mundus that's just sitting out there in the void like everywhere else?
So I find Mankar's motives are kind of hard to pin down, but it does in a way come back to our discussion before about how it would work if the cycle starts again and Lorkhan brings back his armies and wins this time. Is that almost seems like what Mankar gets at, because the whole idea is to bring back Mehrunes Dagon to achieve Numantia, which is liberty, it's freedom. Like Lig was destroyed and torn apart and the whole realm was undone, and Lig was a parallel place to Tamriel, to Mundus. So the idea is to undo Mundus and kind of start again. And, there's a line here which, I'd be interested to hear what you think, but there's a line that specifically refers to the usurper, which everyone assumes is the Cameron usurper in his, tear across the west coast of Tamriel. Mm-hmm. But it says, even the usurper went under the Iliac before he rose up again to claim his fleet. And I see the usurper. That's to me, that's talking about Lorkhan coming again to win the fight the second time. Like that's kind of just a, I haven't thought too much about that idea. But if he went under the Iliac, it's almost like the Red Guards with Tulpapa's stick stabbing him in the heart at Convention in the Iliac Bay. So he lost that battle against Auriel and Trinomac. And the idea is unmake this world where Lorkhan lost, and remake his Daedric realm where he is the god king of his realm, and no one's gonna usurp it from him.
I don't
know.
That's
a lot of crap going on there.
No, I think it's an interesting take of it. I do still think that it's probably just because of him being Menkar Cameron and the Cameron usurper, and using the Iliac. I don't know, Iliac specifically. It just makes me think of it's very geographical and modern terminology
for sure.
But yeah, no, it's
But
yeah.
Okay, here's a question: If Menkar really though wanted to undo Mundus, how does his paradise play into all of that? If he wants to kind of undo it all, would he just be staying in his paradise, or would things start again in a new reality where, you're saying, Lorkhan isn't
I can't remember.
betrayed,
was his paradise not sort of a place for the followers to sort of exist while Mehrunes Dagon screws shit up until
they go there in
better?
death? They go there in death.
Yeah.
But it's interesting when you look into the theories that Menkar Cameron could be an Aelid or fashioned himself to be one or whatever, that he designed his paradise, and of course they could just be reusing in-game assets, but to be this Aelid paradise, an untouched Aelid ruined paradise. It looks all beautiful, and he's got his throne there that he rules from, and a statue to Dagon out the front, and he brings his children there.
Maybe it's perhaps using Mehrunes. Maybe the whole concept behind Mehrunes Dagon is because perhaps if you look at Lorkhan is doomed to fail as part of the cycle for the existence, perhaps, or as part of the usurping, or maybe that Mehrunes Dagon kind of might succeed in the next run where he may fail and restore the sort of
the problem with Dagon though is that he's a god of revolution, and so he wants to turn, as Drew said, wants to turn the hourglass upside down. So if Lorkhan's on top, I feel like just by Dagon's nature, he'd want to overthrow that just because it's a thing to overthrow, and I'm a god who shakes things up. He's not like Molag Bal, where he's like, okay, I'm on top, this is how I want it to be, and I just rule and dominate everyone. There's this kind of you can't have ambition if you're already just in such a totalitarian, domineering state where you've already won.
As a sort of a wrap up thing, because I'm just trying to think about the cycles and about the idea that Lorkhan's death or destruction or defeat or whatever might be an essential part of the cycles. But I'm on maybe that's just purely a mythological view, but I just don't see how it exists without his death. I don't know, maybe it's just purely just because all of the mythology seem to say so. I guess even the Yakuden one is a little bit more abstract, but Yakuden one's the only one that I think that's outside of it, because it sort of asserts that the cycles and worlds are kind of beginning before Sep's or Lorkhan's involvement. So it's kind of who makes an alternative world.
I don't want to confuse things more, but I'm going to in saying that this is what I love about the Elder Scrolls, is that you can't truly rely on anything. So one thing I'll say about that is, there may be evidence to prove that he does have to die for it to happen, in which case, I'll stand corrected. But an interesting thing to think is that all of the mythologies that we've read through or that we know about this world, they're going to be documented by inhabitants of this Kalpa, of this cycle. It's the history is the history of what happened this time. Next time, if Shaw comes back with his army and fights Auriel and his elven army, the mythologies could be completely different, because the dawn time is where everything takes shape. Just to hit on what you were saying about his Aelid origin, is this contradicts the idea that he actually did want to do what he wanted, to give Lorkhan back his Daedric realm. But at the same time, if he is an Aelid and he hates men and he wants revenge for the slave rebellion, then he might simply want revolution purely to end Lorkhan's creation and send the elves back to Auriel, which he would believe if he was an Ayleid and lived in lived in Somerset and lived in an elven society. So, God, I don't even know his motives as much as I love his character.
The only reason I think maybe that I lean more towards that there is some sort of like essential component of the cycle of that, the cycle repeats itself, that there's the destruction and it and of it's technically Auriel or Alduin, whatever, the end part of Akka, whatever you want to call it, brings it back to the dawn. The only reason I guess I think of that sort of endless cycle is because of the whole path to Kim kind of stuff and all of that sort of purpose. The idea that if you just just to remember the layers, and Anu Padme's here, but then the Godhead's here, and you kind of want to get there, but to go down further with the smaller derivatives can then go back up. Whereas if you sort of stay as a god, just your concepts there, they might be more limited or something because I don't know. It's whack, but do you know what I mean? Like, because there's a lot of, we can kind of briefly, and we probably should, is just touch on Shezareen. So there's this idea that there are these avatars that are essentially living components. Because we look at, you look at Lorkhan, Heart of Lorkhan, he's dead god and all that kind of stuff. But there's these ideas that there is Shezareens, which are avatars of him that are sort of existing living components that somewhat embody parts of him. There's interesting stuff there, and we don't get a lot of answers because, like, Pelennor, when someone called him Shore, I think, or used the name, I can't remember, but that person gets smothered with ancestor moths and so on, and there's kind of some interesting hidden stuff going on there. And there's the ideas that the last Dragonborn is a Shezareen, and that's why you fight Alduin and you actually stop the cycle from ending, and you keep it, you keep mortality going. There's also the idea that Hjalti Earlybeard and so on, and everyone, Zurin Arctus and Ismi Wulfarth were all Shezareens. And they, together, when their souls joined, became a sort of almost reincarnation of Lorkhan, or some form of consciousness being Talos. But that's also another whack idea that needs a lot of stitching. But yes, so Shezareen's avatar it comes from the word Shazar as just an alternative name for Lorkhan.
What's with Kirkbride's list of Shezareens that have like the letters of Lorkhan?
I think that's
next to them.
Yeah,
because it's not like an acrostic poem. Like it's Wulfarth L, Hjalti O, Ismir R. Like it's like I don't know where it comes from. And then after 6 Type of Septum A, there's the letter N, which I'm guessing is like the mathematical, like like the nth degree, like N, just an endless series of possible Shezareens. Maybe like I don't know.
Maybe it's that fine,
unspecified.
It could be this theory of the there will come a Shezareen who, because the Shezareens carry out Lorkhan's will, the one who succeeds in finally stopping the cycle. Because I guess as you were saying, is that if the cycle exists, that's Akatosh or Auriel winning, because you have the beginning, the end, the beginning, middle, and end, and then the cycle starts anew. Whereas if Lorkhan ever were to win, he would never allow for the cycle to end. It'd go on forever, and his, this iteration of the mortal realm would be infinite, because he would stop the potential of Alduin eating the world and beginning it again.
Yeah.
But
I wonder if there's any interesting nod, like, there's not a lot to go on, but just, the whole premise there of Alduin anyway is, in Skyrim's storyline, they send him forward in time because he was supposed to end the world, but he doesn't, and sort of dominates it, but then they send him, then he, I guess, is decided he's going to
forward in time.
Yeah, send him forward in time to prolong the cycle, and he's come late basically. I don't wonder if there's any sort of anything you can pull from that. Maybe that previous cycles did sort of end much shorter already. That they generally were shorter, and
he's going to come back in Elder Scrolls 6, right?
There's also the moments, I think, where there might be some interesting clarity is in Dragon Breaks. Well, not clarity, that's like the antithesis of a Dragon Break, but in the moments with Ismir Wulfarth and Wulfarth's secret song and so on, and going like, oh, don't you know what this really is, or what war we're really fighting, and so on. It's all hinting at a larger metaphysical thing in relation to Shore and what the purpose of the realm is and all that kind of stuff. But it's just interesting that Dragon Breaks would be the one time, I guess, in the cycle and the flow of time that there is sort of a way to conceptualize outside of it, if that makes sense. Like, for the characters, it's just really like, because because time's broken at that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that maybe that needs to be a little more cooked up, but idea.
Well, I think we've come to the end of the Lorkhan podcast.
We could probably just keep theorizing
yeah,
random stuff.
Otherwise, it'll go forever. But
well, which Lorkhan would want? He'd want it to go forever.
Perhaps
the cycle's going to start again next week with the next podcast.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. As always, social media links are in the description if you're interested, as is a link to buy our merch if you want to get a sick FudgeMuppet tee and help support the podcast. And we'll look forward to nerding out with you again next week.